and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to repot two orchids, including this Brassolalia Cattleya Wine Leopard Xinghua, which I've had in bloom for a month, so let's dive right in. So for this repotting, I use alcohol for sterilization, and I've got two cutting tools so that I can cut the roots of the orchid. And I always start out by sterilizing my cutting tools to make sure that there's no basically bad stuff that can go from orchid to orchid. Um, and yeah, as you can see, my last tool was a little bit dirty, but I want to make sure that everything is squeaky clean. And just for best practices, anytime you use your scissors for one orchid, you want to make sure that you sterilize them for the next orchid. I also use hydrogen peroxide, and this is to kill any bugs or any pests inside of the roots. I used some sphagnum moss for this repotting, and I also used a mixture of orchietta bark with perlite. I got this mixture at Repotme. So I used a nice little mixture as well as pots. So I have a 4-inch pot and a 5-inch pot for these orchids. So I have a tray as well where I put everything so that everything is nice and tidy. And yeah, we're ready to jump right in. So the first step is to soak this orchid in the sink, which I did for a while, and then take it out of the pot. You always want to keep the label to make sure you know what it is. But the first thing I noticed when I took this Cattleya out of the pot was that it had some packing peanuts, and the medium was actually in pretty good shape. So it actually didn't need a repot, but with a nursery that you're getting orchids from, you never know if there's bugs or any pests inside, or if the roots are a little bit wonky. So I'd rather be safe than sorry, which is why I always repot after the bloom or right away if I see anything unusual. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking a look at the root system, seeing if it's okay, and I'm taking out the bark pieces, which tend to be stuck to the roots. So as I said, I've soaked this for a little while. So far, everything was pretty easy to come out and release from the roots. So I'm being very careful to take out the bark and making sure that I'm not ripping out any pieces of root, because any healthy pieces of root help the overall plant grow. So I'm being very, very careful. I'm inspecting everything now just to make sure that the roots are healthy. And you can sort of tell if a root is healthy if it's firm, or like in this case, you could see that as I'm pulling the root, it like tugs away very easily. It's very papery, and the velamen just comes right off. So I'm just feeling the roots, trying to get a sense of what can stay and what can go. This root system is in pretty good shape. There's not that many dead roots, and the medium, like I said, is pretty good. Like, it probably didn't need a repot. I didn't see any pests in it when I repotted, and everything was very firm, not broken down, but always better to be safe. So I'm just inspecting this Cattleya, seeing if there's any issues. I couldn't find any other than a few roots, and I'm trying to plan out where I'm going to pot it in the pot, because typically these orchids grow from the newest pseudobulb. So usually the bigger one, if you're taking good care of it, is the newest one, and then it'll continue to grow in that pattern. So I gave the orchid a quick rinse, and then I sprayed hydrogen peroxide. I really should have just sprayed the hydrogen peroxide before the rinse, because I diluted the peroxide a bit. But the whole purpose of the hydrogen peroxide is to kill off any pests. So any worms, any snails, any spider mites that the orchid may have, this takes care of it. This was certainly a pleasant repot. I didn't find any critters in there, but I've repotted some orchids with some pretty nasty pests before. So the next step is important. It's to get rid of the dead roots. And you can tell if a root is dead, if it's very papery, or if you pull on it and it breaks off very easily, it's not very firm. And usually these roots tend to be under the older pseudobulbs. So in the case of this plant, you could sort of see the small pseudobulbs and then you see a larger one. This one has a few. Usually the older ones die off over time. And then the newer ones are with the newest pseudobulb, and in this case it's the taller one in the plant. And you want to make sure you cut off the dead roots because then it can decompose in your new medium. And in this case, I didn't have so many bad roots. I mean, this root system isn't super extensive, but I just cut off anything that was papery, wasn't healthy. I feel them to see if they're firm. I go one by one, and then I took care of it. So it could be a little tedious, so let's fast forward through cutting all of the roots, but essentially I'm just feeling which ones are alive. The ones that are alive are firm and very easy to tell if they're alive. The dead ones are very papery. They don't feel firm at all. They feel a little squishy. When you tug on them, they sort of break easily. You can tell as you're feeling them which ones are need to go and which ones are good to stay. So after cutting off all the roots, I soaked it in water for a little while to make sure that the roots get a little bit more flexible because they can be pretty firm and hard to put into a pot, so it's a good idea. I also cut off the flower spike on top, which lost its flowers, which you no longer need. And I put this into a 4-inch pot. I think it's enough for another year of growth. And there's some roots there that are a little tough, a little um, inflexible, very firm. So I'm making sure when I'm putting it in that I don't break them, I don't force them in, and I start paying attention to the newest growth because the future growths will come likely from that newest growth. So when repotting, I like to start with a little bit of sphagnum moss just because it's really, really hot in my environment in the summer and I have to water all the time. So sphagnum moss in the bottom and a little bit closer to the top helps me maintain moisture. And then I add in a lot of bark. So this is a Cattleya. They don't like to be soggy, so I'd never use all sphagnum moss. It's just supplemental to maintain the moisture. So I'm adding my bark right now. This is a really nice mixture from Repotme. It won't break down very quickly, so in a year or two, probably 1 year since this pot is pretty small. But when I repot this, I know it won't break down very quickly. And usually when you repot an orchid and you use very cheap medium, it can break down, and when it breaks down, it suffocates the roots. So that's something you never want. So right here, I'm just taking off the little papery sheath that you don't need it. You just have to be careful you don't cut the orchid when you're doing that. And my reason for doing that is it was just hanging out a little bit, and I'm also trying to see if there's any roots coming out of the newest pseudobulb. As I started potting, I did notice two eyes coming out of that newest pseudobulb, which can tell me more or less the direction of future growth. Um, so I think that based on what I saw with this orchid, it had two directions to grow. So you always want to make sure that the newest growth is towards the middle so that other growths will not get crowded at the edge of the pot. So that's why I've got the newest growth towards the middle. And so forwarding a little bit, I adjusted the orchid so that the newest growth was more towards the middle. So I took out some of the medium and repositioned it. I'd rather do it right now than get stuck with, you don't want to repot an orchid many times because it disturbs the root system and it'll set your orchid back. So I'd rather do it right. And if I did it wrong initially and I saw it was off, I'm just going to take it out and do it right away. Because once it's growing roots, once it's establishing, you don't want to touch it again for a while. So I adjusted everything and I was very happy at the end with the positioning. And I think the new growths will just sprout out. And as you can see, there's plenty of room there in the middle for them to grow. Now this is looking done. All it needs is a drink of water and it's good to go. So I gave the orchid, I need to give it some stability since it moves a little bit. So when I shake it, it's a little unstable because the roots aren't super established in the pot, obviously. So I put a stake into the pot and then I'm going to tie it with a twist tie to the largest pseudo bulb, and it'll make sure that it can anchor it so it can't move too much. And this will make sure that the roots adhere to the bark and the medium and grow in comfortably without being disturbed every time I move it or water it. So staking this adds stability, and I just want to make sure that if I move it around, it's not moving. I gave it a little shake. It's no longer wobbly, which is great. And the medium is nice and airy, which is great. That's why we pot everything in bark for cattleyas. They like a little bit more air, so I didn't stuff everything down. It's not soil, and I just put my tag. I disinfected it just in case with a little bit of alcohol, and this one is all done. So this one was more challenging because this one had more roots and you could tell that it was in the pot much longer than the last orchid. So what I did was I soaked this orchid in water for some time to loosen everything up, and I took the orchid out of the pot. Um, some of the media was broken down and I just kept it in the pot to not make such a huge mess. I didn't find any bugs in it, which is great. I usually, with broken down medium, find a bunch of different critters in there. But this one took me a while. So this one had sphagnum moss on top as a top dressing, I think to keep everything moist inside, similar to how I do it. But the sphagnum moss had algae and it grew into like a grass. So this one was tough to take out. It took me maybe 20 minutes to get all of the media off of the roots and clean everything up. So we'll fast forward from here. So same thing here. At this point, now that I've taken all of the medium off, or as much as I can, I'm feeling the roots to see what's alive and what's dead. And I want to make sure I can get rid of any papery, not firm roots, because anything that dyes in the medium can decompose, and that is not great for the overall orchid. You don't want everything decomposing quickly. And you never want to forget from going from one orchid to the other just to disinfect. So I use alcohol since I just used my cutting tools on the last orchid. And this makes sure that if one orchid has a disease, it's not transmitting it to the other orchid because they can be pretty contagious. So I just use my scissors to cut any dead roots and clean everything up. So here's what we're left with. We've gotten rid of all of the dead roots. I was smart this time and used the hydrogen peroxide first. That's the correct thing to do if you wet the roots. The hydrogen peroxide would just get a little bit more diluted. So I added the hydrogen peroxide to kill off any pests if there are any. It's just a preventative measure. It won't hurt the plant. And just to clarify, this is hydrogen peroxide 3%. Anything stronger can hurt the plant, so I always use just 3%. Just let it sit there for a while, and then I cut the flower spike at this point. Sorry it's not in the frame. And then after a couple minutes that I've let the hydrogen peroxide work, I left it for about 10 minutes. I gave it a rinse, and then I was ready to put it into the pot. So what I was doing here was looking at the growths. So you could see the rhizome. The rhizome is that long area where the orchid grows out of. So you can see that the smallest growth is the first growth, and then they progressively get bigger. The tallest growth is the newest growth. So I don't want to put this in a big pot because if I put it in a big pot, it stays a little soggier longer. So the smaller the pot, sort of, the more drainage this orchid gets. And I'm going to put some sphagnum moss to maintain moisture, but I don't want it to be soggy. So I'm trying to plan out how I'm going to put this orchid in that pot, in this 5-inch pot. I don't want to go too much bigger, but I want to make sure that it has another year of growth accommodated. And what I did was I looked very closely at the orchid base, and I noticed two little eyes form on this orchid as well, where I think that there will be a new growth coming on either of those from the newest pseudobulb. So what I did was I just planned out and left some room on either side so that it can accommodate for the growth. And as usual, I started with a little bit of sphagnum moss on the bottom, some bark, and then kept adding a little bit of sphagnum moss, and then I added my orchid. I wanted to make sure that it is very open. It's not packed super tightly. You don't want it to be like a soil, so you also don't want to impact the roots too much. So I'm very careful as I'm putting everything in. I also added a stake this time before I potted, just to make sure I didn't disturb any roots. After potting, it's always better to add it first if you can. So the stake is just to add more stability and make sure that the plant doesn't move as the roots adjust. So the roots eventually grow into the medium and they stick to the bark and they stick to the pot. They take over a little bit more and then get adjusted, but in the very beginning, it's normal, especially if you don't have that many roots, that the plant can be wobbly, which is perfectly fine, perfectly normal when you move from one pot to another. In this case, it wasn't too wobbly. It had a decent amount of roots, but rather be safe than sorry. I did cut out a good amount. So I have started accommodating and adding more bark and more sphagnum moss, making sure it's airy. And these are the areas where I think that the new growth will come out of either side. So there's a little bit of space on either end for it to grow in. I'm hoping it grows in on the left side, but we'll see. I'll keep you guys posted. And I'm adding a little bit of sphagnum moss. I don't pack it tight. You never want to pack sphagnum moss tight because it holds a ton of water. So I just keep it very light. Again, the goal is to make sure that this pot can maintain some moisture, but cattleyas, they like to be on the drier side. I just do this because of my climate. It's hot. I don't want to water every single day, so this helps me out. And there are a ton of air pockets in here, so I'm pushing down very lightly to make sure that there's potting medium and no huge air pockets, just so that there's a little bit of contact with everything. So we are all done. My tag is back in the pot, and I'm really happy with how this came out. Another successful repotting, and I'm really happy that I was able to do this now because it is still August, so it's still warm in New York, and these orchids really like warmth, and they tend to grow when it's nice and hot outside. So since I repotted now, I can make sure that, you know, some growth happens before it gets cold when they slow down and they can reestablish in these pots. And then it'll set the tone for the rest of the growth cycle. So once they have strong roots established, they then grow new pseudobulbs or new leaves. And then once they grow new pseudobulbs and leaves, they need light. And then once they get sufficient amounts of light, water, fertilizer, then they're able to give me some new blooms. These guys are all set. I don't have to repot them for at least a year, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. Thanks everyone for watching. Bye.